Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 11, Persia and India. Now to get to the history of Persia, we have to start way back, around 1000 BCE. Indo-Europeans moved into the Iranian plateau, and here is the Iranian plateau there. And there were two main groups of Indo-European speakers who moved in. These were the Medes, that you can see here with the rounded hats, and the Persians, who wore Reese's peanut butter cups. Now, Cyrus the Great united these two groups to form the Persian Empire in 550 BCE. And over the centuries, many different Persian empires would rise and be conquered, but the name Persia always stuck around. Now you'll recall from last lecture that the Seljuk Turks moved into Persia around 1000 CE. And along the way to migrating into Persia, they converted to Sunni Islam. You also remember that they blended their culture with Persian culture in creating, their government and this whole new Seljuk Turk and later Ottoman Turk culture. You also remember that they created this vast empire that spanned from Anatolia in the west, into Persia and all the way to the very borders of China. This empire, of course, included Baghdad, where there was a political and religious leader named the Khalifa, and that's where he resided. And during the Seljuk times, the Khalifa really just kind of became a religious leader, more than a political leader and a religious leader. We'll also remember that the empire fractured among the sons of the Sultan and different uprisings that happened, and within 100 years, the whole empire just kind of fractured apart, and Persia became its own state once again, as did many other different parts of the empire. In the 13th century, there was a different migration. There was a different migration of people from the east. These were the Mongols, and they didn't just invade into Persia. The Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors, they spread almost everywhere. Here they are going into Persia. There they are moving in even to Anatolia. They're along the Danube against what would be Russia, the small state of Russia, into northern China, making their way into southern China as well. So Persia was just one of the many areas that were conquered, and in 1258, the Mongols captured Baghdad. This was a lot like the fall of Constantinople that would come around 200 years later. It was very difficult to do. It took 13 days to actually take Baghdad, and there was lots of looting of historical and religious places. One of the major, catastrophes of the fall of Baghdad was that the Grand Library was destroyed, and this library contained a great deal of information that was just lost to us. So, not great. During the capture of Baghdad, the Khalifa was killed. There are two different traditions of what happened to the Khalifa. The Mongols either rolled him up in a carpet and then trampled him by their under their horses, so that the royal blood wouldn't get on the horses, or they locked him into a tower and only fed him gold until he starved to death. All of the Khalifa's sons were killed except for one, who was then forced to live in Mongolia, which is up this way. And he supposedly married and had children, but never again did he hold a position of any religious or political power. Baghdad itself was greatly depopulated from this capture, and it would take centuries for the city to recover. Now, part of this great empire that was the Golden Horde of these Mongols, was Persia and parts of the Middle East. Here is the part here of the Golden Horde that stretched across this, and it was called the Ilkhanate. So, under the Mongol rule, this area was called the Ilkhanate, and it was named so because it was ruled by one of the Khans of the Mongols, the Ilkhan. In general, the Mongols were very tolerant of the religions in this area, and they often combined many different elements of different religions together. For example, the first Ilkhan of this area, the first ruler, was a Nestorian Christian, which is another of those long ancient lines of Christianity, this one in the east. But he converted to Buddhism on his deathbed. And the whole while throughout his life, he still practiced different traditional Mongolian religions as well. So his line would continue to be Buddhist until Ghazan Khan came around. He became the 7th Ilkhan, and just as with all the Khans of different little areas in the Golden Horde, he was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. But he needed local support to solidify his rule, so he converted to Islam in 1295. In his day-to-day life, he probably still continued to practice, the traditional Mongolian shamanism, but for all intents and purposes, he was a Muslim now. And this is Ghazan Khan over here studying the Quran. The Ilkhan, Ghazan Khan as Ilkhan, still continued to practice tolerance towards many other religions. And the man himself was a man of many talents. He spoke Mongolian, Arabic, Chinese, Latin, among just a number of other languages. He was known as a painter, and he made saddles and spurs. He practiced chemistry. As Ilkhan, he standardized weights and measures, pretty normal practice as we've seen so far. He constructed schools, hospitals, and post offices. And he reformed the military a bit, creating whole new guard units. And one of these units was made of Mongols who had actually been sold into slavery by their poor parents. So he made these whole special units of these Mongols who had been sold off. Even during the time of Ghazan, there was a lot of local unrest still. The people themselves probably didn't really like foreigners ruling over them. Well, I mean, they definitely didn't like foreigners ruling over them. And some of this unrest was caused by the followers of a religious and spiritual leader who was important to locals around him, a guy named Safi al-Din. Safi al-Din himself was a Sunni Muslim, and in fact, all of the Ilkhanate, once Ghazan was there, that was the majority of people were Sunni Muslim. And this order would grow in importance, this order that Safi al-Din kind of founded. They'd grow in religious and political importance in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Ilkhanate began to weaken in the 1330s when the Black Plague arrived. Many people died from it, just like they would in Europe. And within 10 years, the entire Ilkhanate fractured apart. But up in this Khanate right up here, just north of what had once been the Ilkhanate, we're going to see the next leader of Persia begin to make his name. This man was Timur, or sometimes known as Tamerlane in the West. He was a Turco-Mongolian warlord, and he tried to restore the Golden Horde in the latter part of the 14th century. Now, he was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, so he could not call himself a Khan, but he went by the title Amir, which is like a general. And he had his own Khan as a figurehead. So he was just the general for this figurehead, but in all honesty, Timur controlled everything. He had the real power. He was a Muslim, and in fact he called himself the Sword of Islam, which is kind of funny because Timur in his Turkish language actually meant iron. You know, oftentimes iron makes swords, so. But called himself the Sword of Islam, and here we see what Timur probably looked like. This is actually a facial reconstruction from his skull. So this should be pretty accurate to what he looked like. Love that conical hat. That's a great hat that he has. Timur conquered he conquered all of the small states that came from the Ilkhanate. So all that area that had broken apart in the Ilkhanate, he conquered those small states, and he went east and conquered northwest India as well. So not just content holding what the Ilkhanate had once held, he goes further, gets into northwest India, extends the empire even north into Georgia, and he won some battles against the Ottomans and the Mamluk Sultanate. He planned to invade China because they had kicked out their Mongol rulers, but on his way to invade China, he died and never actually got into Chinese territory. The dynasty that he founded would rule Persia until 1507. So, you know, Timur makes this this dynasty that rules in Persia for a little bit. And he has a little bit of a mixed legacy then. Central Asia, you know, this area right around here, really, really likes Timur. But in much of the areas in the Middle East and, you know, Persia, Iran, and India, not really the most loved figure in history. By 1500, much of the Timurid Empire had fractured off. Just like we've seen with all the other larger empires, they just slowly start to fracture apart. They're still kind of around, but in a much smaller form. And from 1501 to 1510, a man named Ismail united Persia. Ismail was a descendant of Safi al-Din, but he was also the descendant of earlier Byzantine emperors. And then he added this other claim. He claimed to be a descendant of Muhammad. And this is important because, unlike Safi al-Din, Ismail was a Shiite. And if you'll recall, in Shiism, the leaders, who are both religious and political, they're the same person, they have to be descendants of Muhammad. So he claims to be a descendant of Muhammad. And there's Ismail there. He was greatly aided in uniting Persia with the help of the Qizilbash. The Qizilbash were a militant group that's name means redheads, and that's because of the red hats, here you can see it, that they wore. So they were this militant group among many different tribes, but you know, a key support group for Ismail. Once he took enough territory, he proclaimed himself Shah, which is the king of Persia, and he forced all the people to convert to Shiism, made it the official state religion. So unlike, the Mongols ruling the Ilkhanate, we have a state religion here, and everybody has to convert to it. And that state religion is Shi'ism. He allied himself with the merchant class to help secure his rule, to strengthen Persia, and he tried to expand into Ottoman territory, but was defeated. The Ottomans by this time are getting stronger and stronger. They've already taken Constantinople. So defeated as he tries to move forward. And after he loses to the Ottomans, he kind of just retreats into his palace and doesn't wage any more military campaigns, and kind of allowed his advisors to rule for him. He also began to drink heavily and unfortunately died at the age of 36. So he was a really young man when he lost this and just kind of, wasted away. Ismail's son, Tahmasp, ruled for 52 years, but early on he faced a lot of civil strife, including one of the Qizilbash trying to take the state over. Persia during this time was also attacked multiple times by the Uzbeks, and Suleiman the Magnificent invaded Persia 4 times. So you have civil unrest under Ismail's son, and you have external threats and actual external invasions. And after Tahmasp, there was a struggle for succession between his sons. And all of this weakened Persia quite a bit, and weakened the Shah's position, which made him more reliant on the Qizilbash. And here you can see some of the invasions from the Uzbeks, from the Ottoman Empire there. One of the Qizilbash actually overthrew the Shah and made himself mentor to this Shah's son. And with that Shah being overthrown, we have the rise of Shah Abbas. So Shah Abbas, 16 years old when he took the throne, the Qizilbash thought they could easily control him. They'd gained more and more power over the last 3 Shahs, and they had a mentor, right, who was supposed to kind of watch over him, and really what he thought he could do was just actually rule in the name of Shah Abbas. The mentor immediately started to distribute key government positions to other members of the Qizilbash. And, like I said, they really thought they could control Abbas. But what happened was this 16-year-old began to assert his own power. It was a gradual process. It took about 10 years or so. But one of the things that he did to gain power was there was a plot to execute the Qizilbash who was acting as his mentor. And what he did was he discovered this plot, and he executed all those who were plotting against his mentor. Which kind of seems counterproductive, right? If they had actually killed his mentor, Shah Abbas would be in control, and he wouldn't have to worry about that mentor trying to control him anymore. But what he does is he uses the good reputation that he gains for uncovering this plot and putting those who would have tried to kill this mentor to death themselves. He benefited in name and reputation. And eventually he felt secure enough that he actually had his own mentor assassinated. And he was able to justify this because the Uzbeks were invading, and he told his mentor, hey, you have to go protect the eastern part of our empire. But the mentor didn't do that right away, because he didn't want there to be any rivals for Abbas's attention. And the governor of that area was a friend of Abbas. So After that governor died, then the mentor acted. So Abbas used this reasoning of he didn't protect the empire as a way to have this Qizilbash mentor assassinated. Abbas then began to modernize the army. He created units from Persia's defeated enemies, ones who would then use gunpowder like the Turks. And in some ways, we can kind of see this like Devshirme, right? You have these defeated enemies who become a major force in the army, just like the Janissaries did for the Ottoman Turks. Here in Persia, we see these new units based on gunpowder becoming more powerful. And it wasn't just the units from defeated enemies. He also took units created from Persia's lower classes so that they would be more reliant and more loyal to the Shah because they owed their position to him. And there were two benefits from modernizing the army. Well, the first one was that they were actually using the same kind of technology as the Ottomans, right? It's hard to fight against gunpowder if you don't have it. So, they're beginning to make their technology equal with that of the Ottomans. It also gave the Shah a stronger force in the army that was completely loyal to him. Just like I said, they owed their standing to him, so they became more loyal to him, and then he didn't have to rely on the Qizilbash as much as before. So their influence began to fade in part because of this modernized army. So with his reorganized army, Abbas was able to greatly restore the lost territory and even to expand Persia. He reclaimed lands that was lost to the Ottomans and the Uzbeks, pushed the borders further. He also promoted the arts and trading commodities. He brought in 300 potters from China to help stimulate a porcelain industry in Persia, and here we see a Safavid porcelain piece there. He brought silk workers from Armenia and made the production of silk a royal monopoly, so the Shah and his family controlled all production that these Armenian workers were making. Metalwork also flourished under Shah Abbas. This is a very intricate brass pitcher that is in the Met today, so the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. But you can just see it's got like a dragon handle here, and look at this fine work. Amazing brass work there. And it was during the Safavid dynasty, especially of Abbas, that Persia became especially known for its carpets. These became highly prized in Europe. They had elements of silk in them. They could be other materials as well. This is called the Emperor's Rug, and it is also in the Met, actually. And you can see a closer detail of the Emperor's Rug. Now, all of these goods, as well as others, Abbas tried to export them, especially. Tried to make money by exporting goods, kind of like we saw with Colbert in France. Remember, where exports were really important for becoming a revenue for France? Exports are going to become a major revenue for Persia as well, just earlier. After Shah Abbas, the Safavids began to gradually decline until their dynasty ended in 1736. The greatest impacts of the Safavid Persia in general was their trade and connections with the West, right? with these rugs and whatnot. Also making Shiism the state religion. Before, like I said, it was a Sunni Muslim state, but after this, it would remain Shia. Iran today is still, in fact, Shiite because of the Safavid Persians. So they had a lasting impact in that. From Persia, now we move on to India. And we're going to begin with Babur, who was a ruler of a small kingdom in modern-day Uzbekistan. Babur also happened to be the great-great-great-grandson of Timur on his father's side, and on his mother's side, he was actually a descendant of Genghis Khan. So he's this Turco-Mongolian warlord, kind of like Timur, who he is one of his ancestors. The nobles of his kingdom eventually defected to his brother while Babur was off invading another state, and he lost his home for a while. He spent 3 years then building up a strong army that would be very, very skilled. And instead of invading his homeland again, he went down and invaded Kabul, which is in modern-day Afghanistan. Why did he choose that and not his homeland? Well, his homeland was pretty strong. It was stable. Whereas Kabul was, there was a lot of fighting for succession there. A lot of struggles, and in 1504 especially, there was just chaos there politically. So he goes down there and takes it. After years of fighting throughout Kabul and the surrounding area, in 1519, with a pretty strong base now around Kabul, he invades northwest India, which is modern-day Pakistan. And he continued to move on. And by 1526, he had conquered the Delhi Sultanate and founded the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is just a corruption of Mongol, right? So they're Mongols. Here we call them the Mughal Empire. And for all of this, Babur gets the nickname the Conqueror. Here we can see the empire under Babur in the purple. So there's Kabul, where he started off, once he settled down. The region around and his invasions into Pakistan and then into India proper. From Babur, the throne passed to his son Humayun, who ruled for 10 years, then lost the entire empire for 15 years, and then gained it back with the help of the Safavids. Unfortunately for Humayun, while he, was once again the emperor of the Mughal Empire, so in 1556, he was walking down some stairs, carrying some books, when the call for prayer began to, rise up. And he tried to begin praying. Unfortunately, he kind of gets tripped up and falls down the stairs and dies. After Humayun, his son Akbar became emperor, and Akbar would be known as Akbar the Great, which is kind of funny, because Akbar already means great. So what we actually see is Great the Great. But Akbar the Great. And he was, in fact, a great general. You can see the territorial increases here in this kind of red salmon color. I don't know how to describe this color. But those are the territories that Akbar is going to increase the Mughal Empire. And when we account for all the territory that Humayun had actually lost, the Mughal Empire triples in size from what he inherited from his father. Akbar, besides being a great general, was also a very good admiral. He could especially tell when something was a trap. Wait a second. That's not the right Akbar. Sorry. Besides being a great general, he was an even better administrator. What he did was he created different ministries throughout the Mughal Empire to help him govern. A ministry of the army, which gathered intelligence and offered advice for military positions. A ministry of finance, which obviously managed the empire's finances. One that oversaw law and religion, so they would, make sure that the laws were set and that they were being properly implemented, and also watched over the religious practices. And finally, there was also a ministry of the imperial household, which, besides just the palace and, the family around Akbar, also controlled the infrastructure of the Mughal Empire. The amazing thing about the bureaucracy of the Mughal Empire was that a lot of these positions in it were filled by peoples of many different faiths. There were Muslims, there were Hindus, there were Christians, there were even Buddhists. So all kinds of different faiths formed up the bureaucracy to help him rule. Obviously, the Ministry of Law and Religion, that's going to be Muslims, right, who are going to be in that. But the other ones had a lot of other people of different faiths in it. Akbar also lowered the taxes on the poor and expanded trade. So during his time, not only did the Mughal Empire triple in size, the economy also tripled in size. So Akbar was, he was pretty great. Despite trying to overthrow his father, Jahangir would be the next emperor. So Jahangir tried to overthrow Akbar and still ended up becoming emperor anyways. Usually that doesn't seem to happen, right? If someone tries to overthrow you, you usually remove them. But Jahangir actually made it to become emperor. And he continued to practice many of his father's policies, or to use many of his father's policies. And Jahangir's reign was especially known for its stability. He was very tolerant of religions. He had it so that the secular law that was based on the Islamic law for Muslims and Hindu law for Hindus, which is nice, actually, because you're not forcing Hindus to follow Sharia law, and you're not forcing Muslims to follow Hindu law. So, it's a pretty good idea. He also had it so that Jesuits, those Catholics who were all about preaching and converting, he had it so that Jesuits could openly preach Christianity in the empire. He also promoted art, especially the painting of them during his reign, science, and architecture. And here we see the Shalimar Gardens that he built for his wife, and we're going to see something similar from his son, the building of these monuments for the wives. And the son of Jahangir was Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan had a strong centralized government, just like Akbar and Jahangir. He expanded the size of his army. The empire grew moderately under him. But one difference between Akbar, Jahangir, and now this Shah Jahan was that Shah Jahan was less tolerant than his father and his grandfather. And certain privileges were taken away from different groups And in fact, newer Hindu temples were demolished under Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was also a major patron of the arts, and again, especially architecture, just like his father. Here we see the Red Fort in Delhi, named because it's red. We see the tomb of Jahangir that he built for his father, an amazing piece. You could see all the different little decorations just all around it. It's amazing. And in fact, he was best known for building another tomb, that of his wife, the Taj Mahal. So he built this for his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. So the Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan for his wife. Again, amazing architecture here. Shah Jahan and his heir, one of his older sons, were actually overthrown by one of Shah Jahan's younger sons, Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb was not tolerant at all. Not tolerant like Akbar and Jahangir, and he wasn't even tolerant when compared to Shah Jahan. He had taxes on non-Muslims in the empire, so he imposed new taxes on non-Muslims. He destroyed Hindu temples like his father had, but these weren't just newer Hindu temples. These were some of the bigger, more well-known temples, including 3 of the holiest sites in Hindu culture. So 3 of those temples just completely destroyed, and in their place he would build mosques. Aurangzeb and mainly the Mughal Empire throughout its existence were constantly at war, which under Aurangzeb it did get to its furthest extent down here. You can see it stretching all the way, almost having the entire peninsula of India, just missing down here. But constantly at war, benefited in the sense that it got more land, but it would create some problems too. The non-tolerant policies of Aurangzeb continued after he died. His successors would continue to really focus on Islam, which was a problem because a majority of the people in the empire actually were not Muslim, mainly Hindu. Then you had Buddhists and Christians as well. And as, the tolerance went down, there were many different rebellions throughout the empire, right? No one wants their rights taken away. No one wants to see their temples destroyed. And then when you add the fact that these were still foreigners who were ruling them, it's going to make a lot of people upset, and there's going to be a lot of rebellions, and that's what happens in the Mughal Empire. The fact that the Mughal Empire was constantly at war, with other areas as well as internally, just hastened the decline, right? Wars are expensive. They take up a lot of people, especially if people are dying. And this is really leads to the Mughals declining because of these reasons. And as the Mughals declined, European influence and territory expanded. So remember, we saw that giant, how Aurangzeb had pushed all the way down here. So the Mughal Empire pretty much controlled this whole area here. By 1772, they were limited to just this small little area. Just 65 years later after Aurangzeb. We mentioned the Europeans, gaining influence and now territory as the Mughals declined. what we call the first Europeans in India were when Vasco da Gama landed in India in 1498. Over time, the Portuguese set up trading posts, which were called factories, or they seized key cities along the coast, key port cities here. And we can see the Portuguese holdings on this map here. On the coast, important areas, so these are either their holdings or their factories. The Dutch from the Netherlands followed the Portuguese example in the 17th and 18th century, setting up many settlements and factories themselves, and these are all different Dutch companies here. So we see the Dutch down here, up here, see some even into the Hearts. Agra is where Taj Mahal was built, so a major city in the Mughal Empire there. Yeah, so all around these Dutch factories and settlements were popping up. The French began to take areas in the 18th century, and we could see here the French holdings right along here, and then the allies of the French just beyond them. But eventually these three countries lost most of their territory and a lot of their influence in India to another European power, Great Britain. Great Britain had the East India Company, which sometimes we call the British East India Company because other countries would have East India Companies as well after them. So the East India Company was a joint stock company. You bought shares, just like you would with any stock company. And it was actually founded during the reign of Elizabeth I in 1600. I believe it was December 31st, the last day of 1600. Elizabeth accepted the charter, recognized the charter founding this company. And wealthy merchants and aristocrats were the ones who owned the shares to this company. And like I said, other European countries would copy this method of creating a stock company. The Dutch had their East India Company, the French had their East India Company. So all based on this original British one from 1600. And it was through this company that Britain gradually gained control of all India. They started on the coast, so we see here they are. By 1767, they were in control of the areas that France had once been in control of. This was part of the 7 Years' War. So there's their winnings there. They hold this area. They also hold this area in Bengal. And so they start along the coast and move inward as the Mughals decline more and more. The methods for gaining control and then ruling India were, first off, they created alliances with local rulers. And over time, they would gain control over these rulers. Some would call these puppet princes. I prefer my own term for them, rigged rajas. How awesome is that? Rigged rajas. Yeah. And we can see some of the Allied states in 1805, right here in this little purple. And by 1858, some of those Allied states had become, in fact, dependent states, or just fully incorporated into the Great British Holding. So, yeah, either became dependent states or, just held outright by Britain. Now, it would have been very expensive for the British to bring an invading army to India. So instead what they did was, instead of bringing one there and then having to maintain it, the British used local soldiers called sepoys. Again, this was originally through those rigged rajas, and then later recruited into their own groups. The officers would be British, so the people actually in charge would be British, but the infantrymen were Native Indians. Yeah, they're not Native Americans, obviously, they're Native Indians. And here we see the Madras Presidential Army here. So many different Native Indians in these British armies. Once the areas were taken over in India, the British set up a vast bureaucracy to help run it smoothly. It's a very large continent, so this bureaucracy would help them, ensure their power and ensure that things were running perfectly. And this bureaucracy was called the Indian Civil Service. Indians were allowed into the lower positions of it, but the top of this civil service were members of the East India Company, and then later on they would be actual British government officials, but early on they were just members of the East India Company. Over time, Indians would begin to work their way up into the, little bit higher levels of the Indian Civil Service, but the most top positions were always held by the British, and this was one of the major tensions that developed in colonial India. But we'll look at that later in the semester when we talk more about the Western imperialism of Europeans into different parts of the world. With that, I think we're done with India and Persia. In our next lecture, we'll be talking about another area that was controlled by the Mongols for a while, China. This is Greg, signing off.